What would you do if the cold, unfeeling gaze of a statue suddenly turned toward you in the dead of night? And what if, before you could escape, a voice filled the silence, calling you by your name and recounting every mistake you had ever made? It was 2:30 in the morning in Houston, Texas. The streets surrounding St. Michael's Catholic Church were deserted, illuminated only by the faint light of old-fashioned street lamps. A stray cat darted between parked vehicles. The distant murmur of a highway was the only sound breaking the stillness. On the sidewalk across the street, a man dressed in black stood perfectly still in the shadows. Jack Miller, a name whispered in police departments from Dallas to San Antonio, was about to cross a boundary he had once vowed never to approach. Inside the rectory, Father Michael, the young parish priest, was sound asleep after a long day filled with confessions and preparations for the Feast of the Assumption. A solitary candle flickered in the chapel, its small flame reflecting off the shining marble floor. 3 miles away, Officer Carla Ruiz sat inside her patrol car, sipping warm coffee as she monitored the quiet neighborhood during her night shift. Unaware of what awaited her, she would soon find herself inside St. Michael's before dawn, watching security footage that would force her to question everything she believed was true. Meanwhile, somewhere else in town, in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, Eddie Anderson, Jack's longtime friend and the one who had alerted him, was nervously pacing back and forth. He had confided in Jack Miller about the thousands in cash and gold resting on the church's altar. Yet even he felt a shiver considering breaking into such a sacred place. The church stood like a guardian in the darkness, its red brick exterior and white steeple softly illuminated by the moonlight. Inside, fresh lilies were arranged around a life-size statue of the Virgin Mary, her painted eyes lowered in prayer, hands clasped over a white robe. At her feet lay envelopes filled with money, gold chains coiled within offering plates, and velvet boxes containing diamond rings, presents from countless parishioners throughout the week. Jack's footsteps barely made a sound as he moved from the alley into the narrow rear entrance. He had picked many locks before, but this one's click echoed in a way that felt different. As he pushed the door open, the air was heavy with the scent of incense mixed with a sweetness like flowers after rain. Along the central aisle, the stained glass windows cast eerie colors across the pews despite the faint light. The silence there was more than just quiet. It was dense, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Outside on the street, a single taxi rolled by, its headlights briefly sweeping over the church steps. Above the laundromat, Eddie Anderson lit another cigarette, struggling to shake an undefined unease. Meanwhile, at the precinct across town, Officer Carla Ruiz checked the time, exactly 2:36 in the morning, unaware that this was the exact moment Jack crossed into the nave. He did not move directly toward the altar. Old routines compelled him to inspect every corner, keep an eye out for movement, and listen carefully for any footsteps. The security cameras installed near the ceiling were outdated, with lenses clouded by dust, just as Eddie Anderson had described. Feeling assured, he approached the left transept where the statue of the Virgin stood, encircled by flickering candles. Each step seemed to pull him under an unseen force. The offerings at her feet shimmered beneath his flashlight. Gold chains, watches encrusted with diamonds, stacks of $100 bills held together with rubber bands. A faint, bitter grin appeared on his face. Eddie had been truthful. Then something changed suddenly. The atmosphere, the heaviness in the room, the feeling of solitude. It all transformed in an instant. Yet this moment marked the true beginning of the story. For within the following 60 seconds, Jack Miller, a man who had stolen from the wealthy, the poor, and everyone in between, would hear his name uttered by a voice that should not exist there. From that instant onward, nothing in his life, or in the lives of those who would come to know his tale, would ever remain unchanged. Long before Jack Miller ever stepped inside St. Michael's Catholic Church that August evening, his name had already spread like a whispered warning through the hidden alleys of Dallas. On the city's south side, in a low-income neighborhood surrounded by chain-link fences and cracked concrete, Jack's story began. His father, once a rough oil field worker with a fiery temper and a habit of leaving suddenly, abandoned the family when Jack was 8 years old. His mother, Linda Miller, worked long hours as a diner waitress, serving coffee to truck drivers and managing to gather just enough money to keep their home illuminated. There were times when their refrigerator contained only a carton of milk and a few eggs. Neighbors often recalled him as the boy who was always on the move, sometimes running errands to the corner store for bread, other times fleeing from trouble. Mrs. Anderson, the widow living in apartment 3B, remembered how Jack used to mow her lawn for $5. She once told a friend he had a look as if he had already witnessed more of the world than most boys his age. When Jack was 13, his first real encounter with crime happened on a humid July afternoon. The small convenience shop on Jefferson Boulevard had its door left open, the bell above it no longer working. Inside, the cashier was preoccupied with a delivery. Jack's gaze caught a man's leather wallet partially sticking out of a jacket pocket lying on the counter. No one noticed when he slipped it into his pocket. Finding $42 inside seemed like a small fortune to him. The news of his clever act spread quickly among the neighborhood children. Jack was not just lucky, he was swift, cautious, and unnoticed. By the age of 16, he was moving with a loose group of teenagers who knew which backyards had unlocked sheds, which stores left their cash registers unattended, and which pawn shops did not ask questions. Somewhere along the way, the idea that stealing was wrong stopped troubling him. In Jack's mind, those he stole from could easily afford the loss and would simply replace what disappeared. "It's not like I'm harming anyone," he once explained to Eddie Anderson. Eddie chuckled. Yet there was something in Jack Miller's tone that hinted he was trying to persuade himself. By the age of 22, his petty thefts had evolved into high-value burglaries. Jack mastered ways to bypass home security systems, break into old safes, and disappear before the arrival of law enforcement. Surveillance footage occasionally revealed a tall figure wearing a hoodie, but his face was always hidden in shadow. The license plates on the getaway vehicles were consistently stolen. Detective Mark Reynolds from the Dallas Police Department kept a file on Jack that was thicker than a directory. "We knew it was him," Reynolds would later mention. However, distinguishing between knowing and proving is an entirely different matter. Jack was like a ghost. Over the next 10 years, Jack's criminal ventures expanded beyond Dallas, reaching Fort Worth, San Antonio, and finally Houston. He targeted luxury houses in gated neighborhoods, jewelry shops on quiet Sunday nights, and even a small hospital storeroom where he lifted medical devices worth tens of thousands. His operations were swift, spotless, and left no fingerprints. Despite his expertise, Jack never worked with a crew. He trusted no one fully, not even Eddie Anderson, who only got involved to pass tips or assist in moving stolen items. "You start splitting jobs," Jack once explained, "and eventually you'll be splitting time behind bars." But this kind of existence brought its own hunger. He would often sit in his modest apartment above a pawn shop, flipping through television channels at 3 in the morning, surrounded by possessions he didn't even desire. Unopened watches still locked in their original cases, gadgets never removed from their packaging, jewelry hidden away in shoeboxes. The more he took, the less any of it seemed to matter. Linda Miller, his mother, had stopped reaching out years ago. Not because she lacked concern, but because she could no longer witness her son slipping deeper into a life she had fought tirelessly to protect him from. Jack Miller's younger sister, Emily, once sent a Christmas card with no return address, only the words, "Hope you're okay," written beneath a photo of her children. Still living on the streets, Jack had earned a reputation. Other burglars spoke of him like an urban legend, the man who could break in and out without triggering an alarm, leaving no evidence besides an empty space where a treasure used to be. Yet during quiet moments when the rush of adrenaline faded, cracks appeared. On some nights, he would stand by his window looking out over the flickering neon lights of a 24-hour laundromat, quietly wondering, though never aloud, if there was more to life than this. Those cracks grew wider the night Eddie Anderson showed up holding a beer in one hand and a secret in the other. A secret about a church in Houston with an altar overflowing with cash and gold. A secret that would pull Jack Miller from the darkness he had come to know and thrust him into a kind of brightness he had spent his entire existence avoiding. It all started on a Tuesday night in a dim bar on Houston's east side, the kind of place where the jukebox was always stuck playing old country ballads and the scent of fried food lingered on your clothes. Jack Miller settled into his usual spot in the corner booth, a half-full bottle of Lone Star set before him, when Eddie Anderson slid into the chair opposite. Eddie seemed noticeably worn compared to the last time Jack had seen him. His eyes were lined with fatigue and a subtle twitch at his jaw betrayed his nerves, yet his smile remained. A grin that hinted he was about to reveal something he should probably keep to himself. "Have you ever heard of St. Michael's?" Eddie inquired, leaning closer. Jack simply gave him a blank stare. "The church? Of course. Why?" Eddie lowered his tone and glanced sideways. "Because right now, That place is hoarding more cash and gold than you have seen in ages." Jack did not respond immediately. He knew Eddie had a tendency to stretch the truth in his tales. "You're wasting your time. Churches don't stash that kind of wealth just lying around," Jack said. Eddie was firm. "This one does. It is the week of the Feast of the Assumption, their biggest celebration in years. People have been donating every day. Cash in envelopes, jewelry, family heirlooms, all left sitting right there on the altar." Jack took a slow sip, his face betraying nothing. "You are saying they just leave it all there?" Eddie nodded emphatically. "The old priest, Father Thomas, left this morning for a conference. Only the young priest and a nun are managing the church now. No night security guards, just 2 ancient cameras barely working. My cousin cleans there and told me she has never seen so much treasure in one spot." Behind the bar, Martha Jean, a woman in her 50s serving as the bartender, noticed the 2 men whispering closely. She had seen Jack Miller here numerous times before, usually by himself. The presence of Eddie Anderson and their hushed tones made her stay alert. Jack leaned back with his arms folded. "What is the deal?" he asked. "No deal," Eddie replied. "Sunday morning, everything gets taken to the bank. Until then, it just sits there. I'd wager $50,000, maybe even more. For many, that amount would be life-altering. For Jack, it was the kind of payout that could allow him to vanish for a year or maybe 2. Yet some uneasy feeling gnawed at him when he thought about stealing from a church. In a modest apartment across town, Eddie's cousin Maria Lopez was finishing her night shift at St. Michael's. She had no clue that a casual remark she made to Eddie about the enormous donations would spark this plan. To her, it was merely a comment, proof of how generous the parishioners became during festival week. Back in the restaurant booth, Jack's silence lasted long enough for Eddie to urge him on. "Think about it, man. There are no alarms worth mentioning. The back door leads to a blind alley. You could be in and out in 15 minutes. Jack shook his head. "I don't rob churches." Eddie grinned. "You've hit hospitals before? What's the difference?" That hit harder than Jack expected. He didn't respond, but tapped his fingers restlessly on the table. Later. That evening he made his way home through the damp streets, the air heavy with the scent of rain on pavement. In his apartment above the pawn shop, he stood by the window, gazing down at the blinking neon sign of the laundromat. He told himself it was a mistake at first. Then he convinced himself it was merely another job. By the time the sky began to lighten with the early hints of dawn, he realized his decision was already set in stone. The following 3 days were spent gathering information. Jack visited the plaza where Father Michael served. Mixing with the crowd of tourists, he took pictures of the old brick building's facade. He sat at a cafe opposite the square, sipping coffee while his gaze followed everyone's movements. From his corner seat inside, Lupes Taqueria, the owner, alongside Luis Ortega, observed him through the glass. Luis did not know Jack's name, but recognized the type, someone who noticed every detail silently. Jack noticed the routine. The back alley remained empty most nights. The 2 security cameras were positioned exactly as Eddie Anderson had described. One overlooked the front entrance, the other focused on the altar. Both were models, at least 15 years old. Father Michael was present at odd hours during the day, usually alone. Sister Agnes, the nun, frequently arrived carrying groceries or floral arrangements. Every day, more tributes appeared at the base of the statue of the Virgin. Families brought envelopes, elderly couples left small boxes with jewelry, and children dropped coins into the polished brass bowls. By Friday evening, Jack was fully aware of the timing and the vulnerable points at his entry location. The strategy was straightforward. He would enter through the rear door at 2:30 in the morning, using a set of picks on the old lock. From there, he planned to go directly to the left transept where the untouched statue stood. His goal was to fill the backpack starting with cash, then jewelry, and finally gold. He would leave by the same route, walk 3 blocks to his truck, and be gone within a quarter of an hour. No unnecessary movement, no aimless wandering, no errors allowed. Eddie Anderson offered his assistance, but Jack declined. 1 person in, 1 person out, no witnesses, no complications. On Saturday night, while the city buzzed with weekend energy, bars were full, and music spilled through the streets, Jack had a quiet meal at a diner close to his home. He ordered steak, eggs, and black coffee. Paying in cash, he left a generous tip and walked back without glancing behind him. At 5 minutes before 2 in the morning, His alarm sounded. He was already awake. Wearing black cargo pants, a black long-sleeve shirt, gloves, and boots, the backpack lay empty on the kitchen counter next to the neatly rolled tool pouch. Before leaving, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him was the one that had faced down motion sensors, cracked safes, and escaped sirens. Yet hidden deep within his eyes there was a flicker of something different, an unease he could not define, waiting silently in the darkness. By 28 minutes past 2, Jack was standing in the alley behind St. Michael's. The surroundings were calm except for the distant hum of the freeway. The plan was firmly ingrained in his mind, with every step as familiar as breathing itself. The steady beat of his own breathing was all he could hear. What Jack Miller could never anticipate, nor could anyone else, was that this mission would not conclude as he had imagined. Instead, it would end in a way that would make his reputation reach far beyond the streets where he had spent his entire life lurking. The alley behind St. Michael's was the type of place that most of the city simply did not acknowledge. It was narrow and partially concealed between aged brick buildings. The broken asphalt was scattered with bottle caps and faded chalk drawings left by children who no longer played there. At 2:30 in the morning, it was nothing but pure darkness. Jack's boots made no noise while he moved, his gloved hands carefully sliding the pick into the old brass lock. Years of experience had taught him the secret language of tumblers and pins, and within 3 minutes the door surrendered with a quiet, reluctant click. A distant roar of a passing truck faded away into silence somewhere down the street. The moment Jack stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cooler and heavier, carrying subtle hints of incense, melted candle wax, and something sweet. Lilies, perhaps, though he could not be certain. In the rectory apartment above, Father Michael stirred in his sleep, completely unaware of the intruder downstairs. The young priest had worked late, finishing Sunday's homily, never imagining any threat could come from the church's hidden back alley. Jack closed the door behind him, pausing briefly in the shadowy hallway as his flashlight beam traced a narrow path along the worn wooden walls. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath his feet as he passed by framed photographs of First Communions and parish gatherings. The faces in those pictures seemed to observe him, yet he did not pause to study them. He moved with careful intent. 5 steps forward, a turn to the right, then another 10 steps. According to the plan, the sacristy should be here, and indeed it was. The small chamber carried a faint scent of cedar, coming from the vestment cupboards. Shelves hugged the walls, stocked with altar cloths, candles, and prayer books, but there were no envelopes, no gold, no jewelry to be found. Jack Miller frowned, his brow tightening as he scanned the room once more. There was nothing but items used for worship. Either Eddie Anderson's cousin had been mistaken, or the treasure was hidden elsewhere. On the other side of town, Eddie Anderson sat in his apartment, endlessly chain-smoking by the window, daydreaming about the moment Jack would return with a backpack filled with stolen riches. He had no idea that at that very moment Jack was standing in an empty sacristy, revising his plan. Jack stepped back into the corridor. The only other possibility was the main nave. He crept silently toward the center of the church. The beam of his flashlight caught the stained glass windows that shimmered despite the absence of daylight. The stillness there was different, heavier, almost conscious. Upon entering the nave, the space expanded around him. Rows of dark wooden pews stretched toward the sanctuary, their polished surfaces reflecting shards of colored light spilling in from the street lamps outside. Then he noticed it. In the left transept, illuminated by a faint glow, beneath the soft flicker of votive candles stood the lifelike statue of the Virgin Mary, carefully painted with fine detail, her head gently bowed in silent prayer beneath a flowing blue cloak. At her feet, the floor was crowded with gifts, envelopes stuffed with cash, gold chains coiled like resting snakes, silver crucifixes, velvet ring boxes, and watches that still caught the candlelight with a subtle shine. Surrounding everything were fresh lilies and roses, their scent rich and almost overwhelming. Jack Miller felt his heart race. This was the moment. He crossed the marble floor deliberately, each step softly reverberating against the vaulted ceiling. Kneeling before the statue not out of devotion but for practical reasons, he placed his backpack down and began working swiftly. First came the cash, thick stacks of 20s and 100s, then the jewelry, each item slipping quietly into the bag's dark opening, a gold chain hefty enough to be worth thousands, a diamond-studded watch. Coins, some old and potentially collectible, jingled lightly as they fell in. Upstairs, in a modest apartment just a block away, Maria Lopez, Eddie Anderson's cousin, remained awake, reading in bed. The lily she had laid at the Virgin's feet earlier that day had been the final flower she could afford with her paycheck. She could never have guessed that someone was now moving these offerings aside to get to the envelopes beneath them. Jack worked with speed, yet an unnamed heaviness settled over him. It was not guilt. That feeling had left him long ago. This was something else entirely. He sensed something unusual, a tingling sensation at the back of his neck, an eerie feeling that he was not alone. He stopped moving instantly. His hand gripped a gold crucifix tightly. Gradually, he raised his eyes toward the statue's face. The painted eyes, which he knew were supposed to be looking downward, appeared almost lifelike in the flickering candlelight. He tried to convince himself it was just the shadows. Then the scent of lilies grew stronger, filling his lungs in one overwhelming wave. His flashlight wavered slightly in his hand, casting the Virgin's shadow tall upon the wall. For a brief moment, he thought. No. He was absolutely sure. He saw the shadow shift differently from the statue. At that instant, the mission was still underway. The plan still seemed achievable. Yet something had changed. It was not about money, alarms, or escape routes anymore. Within the next breath, Jack Miller would realize that the treasure he had come to seize was not the most precious item in this church, and what awaited him would transform his life forever. The first indication was the eyes. Jack had encountered many statues before, and knew their faces never altered, painted irises permanently fixed. But as the candlelight flickered in the motionless air, the Virgin's eyes, once cast calmly downwards, rose and locked directly onto him. His breath hitched. The gold crucifix in his grasp suddenly felt much heavier. Upstairs in the rectory, Father Michael stirred once more in his bed. No dream this time, only a faint, unidentifiable noise that seemed to ripple through the walls, more of a vibration than a sound, as if the entire building was gently breathing out. He glanced at his clock. It was 2:41 in the morning. Back in the main hall, Jack Miller's flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering on the marble floor with a sharp metallic ring that sounded far too loud in the stillness. Yet he did not move to pick it up. He could not. Something invisible held him firmly in place. The air grew heavy. The scent of lilies intensified so much it almost made him dizzy. Suddenly a voice filled the space, not coming from the statue or any particular spot, but seeming to come from everywhere at once. Jack. His name was spoken softly but carried a weight that pressed against his chest. The voice was clearly female, warm and tender, yet it carried undeniable authority. At that very moment, in a patrol car 3 blocks away, Officer Carla Ruiz's radio suddenly buzzed to life with static. Although no message came through, she frowned and adjusted the volume knob, feeling a strange tingling sensation run down her arms. Meanwhile, inside the church, Jack's mouth dried out. He tried to respond, but no sound emerged. The voice kept flowing through the air like an electric current. "Son, what are you doing here?" Each word seemed to resonate deep within his bones. He shook his head and whispered faintly, For 15 years, you have taken what was not yours," the voice continued. "You have taken from the hungry, from the elderly, and from those who could least afford to lose anything. Do you believe I have not noticed?" Jack's legs gave out beneath him, forcing him down to his knees, not out of surrender, but simply because his body could no longer support him. The backpack resting beside him fell open, scattering a shine of golden chains and neatly folded bills across the ground. "I understand your hunger." The voice softened gently. "I know your father abandoned you. I know your mother labored until her hands ached and her body grew weary. I know the streets taught you to take before you were taken from. But my son, stealing has not made you strong. It has left you hollow." Hot tears clouded his sight. He had not wept in many years, not since the day they laid his mother to rest. Now the sobs surged uncontrollably, raw and unfiltered. "Do not cry for me," the voice whispered. "Cry for yourself, for the love you rejected, for the paths you forsook because they were more difficult to follow." Somewhere above, a votive candle flickered, then briefly burned brighter. Jack swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I am sorry. Please forgive me." "I have always been here, Jack," the voice assured him. "In every choice you made, in every misguided step, in every night you fell asleep feeling only the burden of your soul. I have waited for your return." Her gaze, or whatever it was that held him, kept him grounded. And for the first time in years, there was something new inside his chest beyond adrenaline and calculation. There was hope. What should I do?" His voice cracked as the question slipped out before he could stop it. "You already understand," the voice responded, and he truly did. With shaking hands, Jack began to empty every item from the backpack. Stacks of cash, pieces of jewelry, watches, coins, carefully setting them down at the feet of the Virgin, just as they had been before. The metal lightly tapped against the marble surface, creating a sound that felt strangely purifying. After placing back the final object, he remained on his knees, uncertain of his next move. The voice spoke again, now much softer. "This is only the beginning. You must mend what you have damaged. Seek out those you have harmed. Give back what you can. Request their forgiveness even if it is not granted. Live truthfully, no matter the consequences." Jack felt a tightening in his throat. "I have nothing left. No money. No honest job. Nothing. You still possess your life. You hold your soul. That is enough to start." He shut his eyes, allowing the message to deeply resonate within him. The atmosphere felt lighter, the scent of lilies fading into something gentler. "When times are toughest," the voice added, "come here. Sit beside me. Talk to me. I will always be here to listen." Then all fell silent. The Virgin lowered its gaze once more, the same peaceful look it had carried for decades. Jack stayed where he was until the first faint morning light slipped through the stained glass, coloring the floor in blues and reds. He did not know how long he had knelt there, only that when he rose, he was no longer the man who had entered. Jack remained on his knees, the cold marble pressing through his trousers as if the very building itself was holding him in place. Restraining him firmly, the final trace of the voice lingered softly in the air like the fading chime of a bell. It had said, "This is just the beginning." Those words weighed on him more heavily than any chain or lock he had ever borne. Upstairs, in the rectory, Father Michael awakened feeling a deep unease, as if something important had just transpired. He walked quietly on bare feet to the chapel balcony and leaned over the railing, peering down into the nave. From that vantage point, he could only discern a solitary figure kneeling before the statue of the Virgin, shoulders slumped as if in prayer or surrender. Jack was unaware of Father Michael's gaze. His eyes were fixed on the items he had recently brought back. Stacks of bills, golden chains, and rings encrusted with jewels shimmered gently in the candlelight. The voice had commanded him clearly, "Find those you have wronged, return what you can, ask for their pardon even if it is withheld, and live truthfully regardless of the consequences." Just the idea churned his gut. Over 15 years spent in numerous jobs, countless victims, and money, perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars, dispersed among pawn shops, underground dealers, and people who would not recognize him until he appeared at their doorstep. Some would despise him. Others would shut the door immediately. Some might call the police as soon as they saw him. Memories flashed through his mind. Martha, the widow whose late husband's watch he had stolen long ago, and Mr. Alvarado, who had come home after working a second job only to discover his store's cash register emptied. Faces he had never taken the time to remember until now floated back to him like scattered pieces of a puzzle thrown on the floor. For a brief moment, the old Jack inside him stirred. The Jack who planned every step, weighed every risk, and left behind no evidence. That Jack would have simply walked away, convinced it had all been a hallucination. But now there was no one to listen to that voice, no one to bear the weight of its words. Somewhere else in the city, in a small apartment above a taco shop, Eddie Anderson sat watching the television, the screen's light reflecting on his face. He waited for a phone call, the sort that came with the sound of tires on wet streets and the jingle of heavy zippers. He did not yet know that Jack's backpack lay empty next to him on the marble floor. Jack shut his eyes. The plan was gone. The escape route, the payoff, the months of hiding had vanished like breath in frigid air. In their place stood something terrifyingly straightforward. The thought of beginning again, with nothing but the clothes on his back, his own hands, and whatever jobs he could find. "I do not even know where to begin," he murmured. Yet the answer had already come. "You know, it was never about grand acts or swift redemption. It would be the long journey, day after day of hard, unglamorous work, saving every penny, knocking on doors he once slipped past under the cover of darkness. The candles trembled as if moved by a breeze, although the air remained perfectly still. At that moment, he understood clearly. He decided to sell everything valuable he owned. The truck, the television, the watches, even the furniture in his apartment. Whatever money he could gather would be sent to the first names and addresses he remembered. If they cursed him, so be it. If they called the authorities, he was ready to face the consequences. If they forgave him, it would be their choice, not something he expected to earn in a single visit. From the balcony, Father Michael observed him rise slowly, as if testing the strength of his legs. The man glanced once more at the Virgin's image, then bowed his head in a gesture that was neither fear nor prayer, but something in between. Jack picked up the empty backpack. It felt odd now, nearly like a reminder of what he had carried inside and what he was about to leave behind. He was uncertain how long it would take to repair the damage he caused. He didn't even know if it was possible. Yet when he turned toward the door, a new clarity filled his chest, one that no robbery had ever given him before. Deep inside that clarity, a quiet promise was made. He would not vanish this time. He would come back. Not as a thief, but as a man ready to fix what was broken, no matter the price. The first step had been taken. By sunrise, Jack was back in his apartment above the pawn shop. The first thing that struck him was how different the place seemed now, not because anything had changed physically, but because he saw it through new eyes. His perspective had shifted, not just because of changes around him, but due to the knowledge of what he was compelled to do. Every item seemed to carry an invisible value in his mind. The flat-screen television mounted on the wall, the leather recliner he had never truly appreciated, the polished oak coffee table, even the truck keys hanging by the door sparkled as if they were coins. 2 days later, the living room stood empty. The television had been sold at a second-hand electronics shop for half its actual worth. The truck was soon traded at a used car dealership for cash, with no questions asked. Watches, chains, and a selection of high-quality tools reserved for major jobs were packed up and taken to pawn shops. By the end of the week, Jack Miller held just over $9,200 in an envelope, and the apartment contained nothing but a mattress on the floor, a folding chair, and a coffee cup. Far away across town, Eddie Anderson heard about the truck sale through a mutual acquaintance. "He's cashing out," the man explained. Eddie assumed Jack was leaving town to avoid trouble. What he did not realize was that the money was not meant for running away. It was intended for paying debts. Jack's first destination was a simple, one-story house on the fringe of Houston. Its white exterior had dulled under the harsh Texas sunlight. He lingered at the edge of the driveway for a full minute before approaching the door, holding the envelope. Inside, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a widow in her late 60s, was folding laundry when she heard a knock. She opened the door to see a tall man in basic jeans and a well-worn flannel shirt. The face seemed oddly familiar to her, but she couldn't quite place it until he spoke. "Mrs. Carter, 3 years ago, I took your late husband's watch." Her hand clenched around the door handle. "I cannot return it to you," Jack Miller said steadily, his tone soft but firm. "However, I can offer you what it was worth. And I want to say, I am truly sorry." He extended an envelope toward her. At first, she hesitated, studying his expression for any sign of deceit. Then slowly, with a trembling hand, she reached for it. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "Because it is the right thing to do," he replied simply. The door did not slam shut. The authorities were never called. She gave a single nod and closed the door gently, leaving Jack alone on the porch, the sound of his own heartbeat filling the quiet. His next stop was a worn corner store in East Houston, its weathered frame hinting at many years of service. The sign above read, "Alvarado's Market," paint flaking, yet the lights remained on. Inside, Mr. Alvarado, now in his 70s, stood behind the counter. The bell over the door chimed as Jack stepped in. The old man looked up, recognition sparking in his eyes immediately. "You?" Alvarado said, his voice tight with tension. "I understand," Jack replied calmly. He placed an envelope on the counter. $2,000 plus interest for the night I emptied your register." Alvarado stared at the envelope, then back at Jack. "I should call the police right now?" Jack did not flinch. "If you want, you should, but I hope you accept the money instead." For a long moment, silence hung between them before Alvarado slid the envelope toward himself. "You should consider yourself fortunate, I believe, in giving second chances," he whispered. Not every encounter was so calm. One individual slammed the door right in Jack Miller's face before he could complete his sentence. Another threatened him with a baseball bat, yelling that some injuries could not be mended with money. Jack did not argue. He simply left the envelopes in their mailboxes and walked away. By the end of the first month, the total of $9,200 had disappeared, distributed among a dozen families. Jack accepted a position mixing concrete for a nearby construction firm, working long shifts under the scorching Texas sun, receiving payment weekly. Every Friday, he reserved half of his paycheck for rent and meals, while the remainder accumulated into a growing pile of envelopes. In a diner near Interstate 45, Maria Lopez, Eddie Anderson's cousin, overheard two patrons discussing a man who was going around reimbursing folks for old thefts. She did not realize it was the same stranger she had spotted at St. Michael's that evening. Not yet. Jack spent his nights with pen and paper, compiling from memory a list of every job, every address, and every name he could recall. The list turned out to be longer than expected. The idea of how much still lay ahead was daunting. But for the first time, daunting did not mean unachievable. Each door he knocked on, each uneasy chat, each envelope passed across a doorstep, was like laying a brick on the pathway away from his former self. Some individuals forgave him immediately, others did not. Regardless, the obligation was his to settle. Somewhere along that long journey, after a tiring journey, the man who once measured his life by the number of stolen items began to measure it by something completely different. He counted the mistakes he had the chance to correct before his time ended. 6 months had passed since that August evening. Jack Miller's list of places to visit remained lengthy, yet the pile of names crossed out was steadily increasing. One night, after finishing his work at the construction site, he found himself standing again before St. Michael's. However, this time it was not under the cover of night. The sun was still shining, bathing the brick walls and the white steeple in a warm amber glow. He paused on the steps. People moved in and out, some lighting candles, others carrying bags of groceries from the parish pantry. None of them paid him any attention. For someone accustomed to staying unnoticed, this anonymity felt almost unfamiliar. Inside the church, the air was filled with the scent of fresh flowers and polished wood. The candles near the statue of the Virgin flickered, their flames steady despite the open doors. At the altar, arranging lilies in a tall glass vase, stood Father Michael. Jack walked slowly down the aisle, his boots softly echoing against the marble floor. The young priest looked up, his hands momentarily freezing mid-action. "Father," Jack said quietly, "my name is Jack Miller. I left a note here several months ago." Recognition sparked in Father Michael's eyes. The man who had promised to return and make amends? Jack nodded. "I believe it is time I share the entire story with you." They sat together in a modest office beside the nave. The blinds were partly closed, and the late afternoon sunlight cast striped shadows across the walls. Jack spoke clearly about Eddie Anderson's tip, the empty sacristy, the offerings left at the Virgin's feet, the eyes that seemed to move, and the voice that had called him by name. He described to Father Michael how he had returned every single item that night, and how he had since spent his life paying off debts nobody expected him to settle. Father Michael listened attentively without a word. When Jack finished, the priest reclined in his chair and remained silent for a moment. Then he said calmly, "Do you remember those cameras you assumed were too old to function properly?" "They worked," he confirmed. "They recorded everything." Jack felt a tightening sensation in his stomach. "Everything?" "Truly everything," Father Michael affirmed. "You entering the church, kneeling before the statue, emptying your bag, and then something else. A light shining from nowhere that bathed the statue and you in its glow." The priest opened a drawer in the desk and withdrew a small USB drive. The diocese had reviewed the footage, and the bishop called it a miracle of conversion. "Father Michael instructed me to wait because you would return." Later that evening in the rectory's kitchen, Father Michael showed Jack the video again. From the steady camera's perspective, the scene appeared almost otherworldly. Jack approached with focused determination. The candle's flicker intensified. Then the man suddenly sank to his knees, his hands moving precisely to put back each object as if guided by an invisible force. Even through the blurry video, the transformation in his expression was unmistakable, firmness softening into something genuine and almost innocent. "You should share this story," Father Michael encouraged. Jack shook his head. I am not good at public speaking. Father Michael replied, It is not about speaking perfectly. It is about letting others understand what you went through. Many people in this city have lost hope that change is achievable, that God still moves in the lives of everyday individuals. Your story might inspire them. Jack looked down at the floor. He had knocked on many doors and confronted men wielding baseball bats, yet the idea of standing before a congregation felt far more daunting. The next Sunday, the church was almost at capacity. The bright morning sunlight passed through stained glass, casting vibrant reds and blues along the wooden pews. Jack sat near the front, feeling his hands grow sweatier by the minute. Once the final hymn ended, Father Michael moved to the pulpit. Before we finish, I want to invite someone to share a testimony, he announced. A man who has traveled a difficult path to be here today. Jack stood up with care, the wood creaking beneath his boots. Turning toward nearly 100 attentive eyes filled with curiosity, doubt, and hope, he stated, My name is Jack Miller, and for 15 years, I lived as a thief. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. He recounted that August night, the scheme, the statue, the unexpected voice, and the choice to abandon everything he had based his life upon. He spoke of making amends, the slammed doors, and the few moments filled with forgiveness unfolded. When he concluded, some eyes welled up with tears while others remained silently reflective. At the back pew, an elderly man gripped his hands more firmly. In the fourth row, a woman leaned toward her teenage son, quietly sharing words only he could hear. Father Michael ended the service with a prayer. As the attendees began to leave, a small crowd formed around Jack Miller. Several wished to express their gratitude to him. A handful wanted to relate their own experiences. One young man, no older than 17, stood apart, quietly observing. That evening, Jack sat alone in his vacant apartment and recognized that this story had grown beyond just him. It now belonged to everyone who needed to believe that the past does not have to determine what comes next, and to everyone who might hear it in the future. The Sunday following Jack's testimony, the pews at St. Michael's were noticeably more crowded. The story had spread swiftly, whispered after Mass, mentioned over coffee at the local diner, shared at the grocery store. People gathered not only to pray, but also to meet the man whose account had moved a congregation unaccustomed to speaking about miracles as if they were happening now. Among the people present that morning was Rafael Torres, a 17-year-old who had been sitting in the back row the previous week. He had spent the past year skipping school, involved in minor theft with a group of older boys. Hearing Jack's words had planted something deep in his mind, a question he was afraid to voice aloud. If Jack could stop, why can't I? After the service, Raphael stayed near the entrance, pretending to look at the bulletin board until Jack walked by. Mr. Miller, he murmured, eyes downcast. I have taken things too. Not much, just a little. Jack hesitated, sensing the boy's anxiety. What is your name? Raphael, Jack nodded. I started when I was 12 and did not quit until I was 35. You still have time to turn away before it completely takes over your life. Raphael seemed unsure. It's not that simple. I never said it was easy, Jack responded, but it is worth the effort. He handed the boy a card with a phone number. Call me tomorrow. I can get you a place on a construction crew. The work is tough, but it is honest. The following day, Raphael arrived at the worksite. By Friday, with his first check in hand, he repaid the store he had stolen from the month before. Others also came forward. Mrs. Delgado, a retired teacher, approached Jack one afternoon to confess she had forgiven a burglary from years earlier, a crime she now suspected might have been his doing. She had never been able to prove it, but seeing his transformation had released her from the bitterness she once felt. In a quiet corner of Lou's coffee shop, Officer Carla Ruiz took a seat opposite him. She had been one of the officers who had examined the church's security footage. I have been in law enforcement for 15 years, she said. I rarely encounter people like you, people who completely change. I just want to tell you, keep going. Jack Miller discovered he was influencing others even without realizing it. He began sharing his story at community centers and later at a juvenile detention center near town. He did not look like a typical motivational speaker, nor did he rely on notes. Instead, he spoke honestly about the falsehoods he once believed, the fears he endured, and the pivotal night that transformed everything. During one session at the detention center, a boy from the back row raised his hand and asked, "So, you mean, if I just apologize, everything will be fine?" Jack shook his head and replied, "No. What I am saying is that saying sorry is only the beginning. You need to live that apology every day for as long as it takes." Although his message was simple, it struck a chord in rooms filled with youth who could easily detect fake sincerity. For them, that honesty mattered more than anything else. The job site was also part of the transformation. Within the next 12 months, Jack hired 3 young men who had nearly fallen into deep trouble. One left within the first week. Another stayed just long enough to save money for vocational training. But Raphael stayed with the team. 2 years later, he became one of the top workers while also attending night school to become an electrician. In the evenings, Jack continued visiting St. Michael's Church. At times, he would find strangers praying quietly by the statue of the Virgin Mary. Sometimes Father Michael would ask him to speak with visitors curious about the story they had heard. Yet the most surprising development was how people began reaching out to Jack, not with questions, but with requests for guidance and support. Money was no longer the driving force. Instead, it came from people seeking guidance to make things right. One evening, a man named Luis Ortega, who owned a local taqueria, called unexpectedly. "I have been holding on to something that does not belong to me for years," Luis confessed. "I believe I need to return it. Can you help me through this?" Jack agreed, and 1 week later, he stood beside Luis as the man handed a stolen ring back to the rightful owner. Moments like that, witnessing someone face a challenge he himself once avoided, made Jack realize how much his life had transformed. What began as a mission to repay debts had evolved into a journey to inspire others to do the same. Although he would never admit it openly, he sensed that the voice from the church had been right. The toughest part was still to come, but he would not be facing it alone. 5 years had passed since the night Jack Miller entered St. Michael's with a plan typical of a thief and left with an entirely different purpose. The apartment above the pawn shop had long vanished. In its place stood a modest 2-bedroom home on a peaceful street in Spring Branch, with a front porch that gleamed in the evening sunlight. Inside, the walls displayed no stolen artwork or illicit luxuries, only framed pictures. One showed Jack in a hard hat alongside his construction team. Another featured a smiling Raphael proudly holding his electrician certificate. And lastly, a wedding photo of Jack and Emily, a parish volunteer who had first offered him a cup of coffee after Mass, without asking a single question about his past. Emily was aware of his past from the very beginning. She once told him, "If you have been forgiven, then I can love the man you have become." Their daughter, Grace, was 3 years old, curious, brave, and already asking her father why he always wore the silver crucifix around his neck. Jack Miller's life was straightforward. Early mornings were spent on construction sites, evenings at home, and weekends occasionally involved driving to small towns to speak at church gatherings or community halls. The work was far from glamorous, however. It was consistent, honest, and above all, well-earned. In the parish records, Father Michael had written a note beside Jack's name describing him as a witness to transformation. It was not a label Jack claimed on his own, but in their community, the phrase stuck. People would stop him in hardware stores, grocery aisles, or on sidewalks just to say they had heard his story. Some admitted it gave them hope for a brother or a son who had gone astray. Others simply wanted to express respect with a handshake. The list of those previously harmed had grown shorter. Some debts had been fully repaid, while others could never be settled with money, only with dedication and time. Jack kept that list in the top drawer of his bedside table, not as a weight, but as a symbol of the path he continued to follow. On one autumn evening, he stood once more before the Virgin statue at St. Michael's. The candles flickered within their glass holders, casting the gentle light he remembered from that night long ago. This time, he heard no voice. He no longer required one. The calmness within him was the answer he sought. From the pews, Raphael observed silently, his hands tucked inside his jacket pockets. He had brought along 2 younger guys from his neighborhood, both teetering on the brink of trouble. "He is the one I mentioned before," Raphael murmured. "If he could turn his life around, so can we." Jack knelt briefly, not out of despair but from gratitude. Thankfulness for the work that still lay ahead, for the second chance he had received, and for the unseen mercy that met him in the darkest hours of his life. Life had not become effortless. There were still bills to pay, long working hours, and moments when old habits tempted him with quick, dishonest solutions. Yet every time Jack recalled the cold marble beneath his knees and the solemn words, "You already know what to do," he realized that redemption was not a single event. It was a life shaped by making the right decisions one by one, and that the past, however grim, did not have to imprison him. Looking back now, Jack often reflected on those who doubted him and on those who believed in him without question. He understood that his journey was not walked alone. It was intertwined with every hand that had pushed him forward and every person who allowed him to seek forgiveness. For everyone who heard his story, his message remained clear. It does not matter how far you have strayed from the right path. There is always a way to return. You cannot erase the past, but you can determine what comes next. And when you choose to come back, you are never alone. If you hold faith in new beginnings and trust that mercy can reach us even in the shadows of life, please share this narrative. Also remember to like this video and subscribe to Touched by Grace to discover more genuine tales of optimism, salvation, and the strength found in belief.